Hello everyone, thank you for coming. I'd like to welcome the writer of Captain Phillips, Billy Ray.
Thank you. Thank you.
First of all, congratulations on the film.
Thank you very much.
And congratulations on your Oscar nomination as well.
Thank you very much.
That must feel pretty good.
Thank you. You know, I'm uncomfortable with how long and how badly I have wanted one of those. I think it's a very unappealing part of myself. But the reason that I want one is not because I need more praise or more fanfare. I don't. It's that the writers that I've always measured myself against, they all have them. You know, Alvin Sargent won 2 of them, and William Goldman won 2, and Bo Goldman won 2, and Patty Chesky won 3, right, which means I have my work cut out for me. If I want to be on a list with those kinds of greats, you know, and feel like I left some sort of legacy behind, this is one of those measurables, one of those metrics by which you can judge yourself. So that's why it's important to me.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about how you first got involved with this project?
Sure. You know, I watched it unfold on CNN like everyone else did. Didn't really think about it in terms of its potential as a movie until I heard that Sony had acquired the life rights to Captain Phillips, and it was a job I wanted very badly. It was an open writing assignment, but I knew I was going to have to compete to get it. So I did as much prep work as I could to get myself ready for that meeting, and then went in and met with the producers, told them what I thought the movie was about, and then they took me into the studio, and it's basically the same meeting. And they had some confidence in me because I had written true stories before. They felt I had some facility with that. So that's how I got the job.
And at the time that you were having these conversations, was a director already attached?
No. No. I went off and did the research and wrote the script and always had Tom Hanks in mind. He was always the only guy who could be Captain Phillips, at least for me. That said, you know, anyone who writes for a living knows you always have a fantasy actor in your head when you're writing, and you never get that actor, ever. I never did once in my career. Until this time. It turns out that his agent, who's a very smart man, was tracking the project the whole time I was writing it. Always had a sense that it was a good part for Tom. So we got the script to Tom. He said yes, which is certainly one of the high watermarks in my career. And then it became a bit of a director derby because who doesn't want to work with Tom Hanks? So a number of directors came forward and the studio chose Paul. Then I went off and worked with him for a while, and then he went off to Malta to make the movie.
You presumably spent some time, or had some access, I would imagine, to the real Captain Phillips.
Sure.
So how sort of what was your sort of access with him, and how did that what was that experience like?
There was a lot of one-to-one. There was a lot of phone calls. There was a trip out to Vermont to see his house and meet his family. The beauty of Captain Phillips is that there were times when I was in a jam writing the script, and I would call him and he wasn't there because he was out at sea. Yeah. You know, this is a guy who could have coasted for the rest of his career. He came home from this a rock star and you know, was sitting with Obama. But he went back to work. You know, that's who he is. He is a 9-to-5 lunch bucket kind of guy, and that's kind of why you want to make a movie about him. At that point, he would just get back to me by email, and you know, there's very little that I know about life at sea, and so I had a lot of questions for him.
Sure. But
he was gracious and great about it.
Is there any difficulty in that scenario? Because obviously you have an agenda to an extent, which is to write the best script, to make the most exciting film you can. And
sure.
You know, so there are times when, you know, the real life character, not in necessarily a bad way, but just being a normal human being, where it's like, well, let's lose that. That doesn't work for the movie, or did you feel like, no, you could just go with the guy you met?
Well, part of the reason why I wanted this job so badly is because how many times in your career do you have a true story that lays out for you like an action movie, has set pieces like an action movie, has great drama, has great characters, has huge politics sort of baked into its DNA, and you don't have to pipe anything to create all that. It was just the truth. Part of that is that he's such an authentic guy. I didn't have to do much to make him a character. You know, God created him. I didn't have to. In the same way that God created, you know, Musey and the other pirates. I didn't have to do much to dramatize this. That's why I wanted the story so badly.
Mm-hmm. And from a writer's perspective, what is it like working with a director like Paul Greengrass, who obviously has quite a distinct style and is not perhaps quite as conventional as some other directors you may have, you know, collaborated with in the past?
It's that line right between terrifying and thrilling.
Yeah.
You know, Paul has a very specific process he needs to deconstruct. he needs to blow something up and then put it back together. He thrives on that kind of chaos. And when I first saw that process sort of unfolding in front of me, it definitely took me aback for a second. But I had access to other writers that had written for him who were able to sort of counsel me through it and let me know that there's an end, and that in the end the script coalesces again. And that gave me a lot of confidence. Paul and I disagreed on almost everything.
Right.
But I've never disagreed with anyone so respectfully or so collegially in my entire career. We loved each other, even though we saw the world in a very different way and therefore saw the politics of the movie in a very different way. And at a certain point, it just became funny how often we were disagreeing.
Right.
But we never lost faith in each other and never stopped treating each other like partners. And there were a lot of drafts that were flying back and forth between me here and Paul in London. But ultimately, he went off and made this, so how could I be anything but thrilled?
And how, what were the kind of parameters or rules that kept coming up with Paul in terms of what were the kind of changes he wanted to make, or the directions he wanted to move it from where you maybe were to begin with?
Well, I had written a more conventional and I think tamer draft when Paul first came aboard. It had a lot of scenes at home with Phillips' wife, which I think of now as my Apollo 13 scenes. That I don't think, looking back, were terribly necessary.
Okay.
I didn't realize that at the time. Paul was very interested in the politics of the movie, and at one point was pushing very hard for a lot of scenes that were taking place in the Pentagon, in the corridors of power. He wanted to see what the people in power were doing as they were deciding what to do about Captain Phillips. He wanted to make that part of the text of the movie. That was not appealing to me. So we both had these parts of the scripts that we were fighting for that the other one wasn't crazy about. And it was ultimately Tom who stepped in and said, the tension will be so great in that lifeboat, you should never cut away to either.
Yeah, yeah.
And so we dropped all the home scenes, dropped all the Pentagon scenes, and just put our money on Tom in the lifeboat, which it turns out was absolutely the right thing to do.
So neither of you got your way, or both of you, depending how you look at it.
Spend 1 second on a movie set, and what you find out is that whenever there's your idea and someone else's idea, you always arrive at the third idea, which is the best. And it's the friction of that debate that yields the best possible work. And at a certain point in your career, you learn to lean into that because you know what it's going to result in.
Now, Paul has a documentary background and kind of shoots even now in a somewhat documentary style with the, kind of the handheld work and it's kind of fast. Does that, so as a writer, once you got acquainted with him and obviously you knew his films and stuff, did that affect the style of your writing or the way you pace things or anything?
No, I didn't. I knew he was going to do what he was going to do, but it had to make sense to me on the page. There's a certain rhythm you develop as a writer that's yours, and you have to be true to it, if at all possible. I knew that there was nothing I was writing that was going to conflict with the way he was going to shoot the movie. That was the big thing.
Okay. Now, you touched on it earlier, but one of the reasons you said that Sony, were comfortable giving you the gig was because you have experience of, real life stories as opposed to movie stories. And I was going to ask, what are the specific challenges? I mean, you've done both, but talking of, anytime you do a story that's based on real life characters or real life events, what are the specific challenges as a writer in that field?
Well, the first thing is you have an obligation to get it right. Particularly in a case like this, where everyone was watching it as it was unfolding. It's a matter of historical record that's pretty fresh in everybody's memory. You can't just invent stuff out of whole cloth, or the movie loses its authenticity. People just lose their faith in you. That's the biggest restriction in terms of telling a true story. And that's why you are so constantly gravitating towards great true stories. Because when you settle on an average true story that you're going to have to pump up in order to create drama, you're just putting a gun in your mouth, and I know better than to do that now. That's the obligation of it. The plus of it for me, the opportunity of it is, as I said, how can I create a better character than Captain Phillips, or a better character than Busey, or better politics than what's going on between those two guys? You've got this one guy in Captain Phillips who's very much a part of the global economy, and this other guy in Busey who's not at all a part of the global economy, and they're both buffeted by these political winds over which they have no control. They're just sort of blowing them together. And what's going to happen when these two guys are in a room together? How are they going to affect each other? How are they going to change one another? What's that battle going to be like? I didn't think that up. That just happened. What I keep feeling is, it's Captain Phillips. It's the courage of Captain Phillips that wrote the story. I was lucky enough to write it down.
Talking of those two characters, Phillips and Musey, to me it felt like, even though obviously it's a Hollywood movie, it's a big budget movie, it kind of felt like it was almost a two-headed. It was really these two men. Everything else is kind of swirling around these two, but really it's the story of just two men and their
I think that's how I got the job. When I went in to pitch myself for this at Sony, I said, this is a story of two captains. They both get up in the morning, get dressed for work, and go to work. And their work happens to be putting them on this collision course. And it was always going to be an examination of leadership, for me at least. I think Paul had a slightly different idea in terms of the movie that he wanted to make. I think that Paul wanted to make a movie that kept asking the question, are we going to be okay? Which is why it's the last line in the movie. And I was very lucky that Paul's wanting to do that did not conflict at all with the movie that I had written. But anyway, for me it was about leadership. It was about how Captain Phillips leads, good and bad, and how Musey leads. And what happens when these two are stuck in that lifeboat together, and who's going to one-up the other, who's going to make the other one yield. So that was the story.
How did you see those two men? Did you basically see them as kind of mirror images from different places, or did you see one as he's kind of this kind of a guy, and he's got? How did you sort of, as you were writing, how did you define those two men?
Well, you always want to dimensionalize your characters, the good guys and especially the bad guys. You don't want any one-dimensional characters up there. And I was not personally interested in a story about an American who was held captive by four nameless Africans who then get their heads blown off. That just didn't sound like an interesting movie to me. So I wanted to tell as many facets of Musey and all the pirates as I could. In Captain Phillips' book, they're referred to as leader, tall guy, young guy, and angry guy.
Right.
So step one was just to give them names. And this was something where I was very lucky that Paul is the filmmaker that he is and the storyteller that he is. He really is quite a genius. It was so important to him to paint a picture of what it's like to wake up in Isle, Somalia. Right. Had it not been important to him, it wouldn't be in the movie. Right. But it's very clear the second you see where Musey wakes up in the morning, he doesn't have the option of going to apply for a job at Walmart. That doesn't exist. There are two businesses that you can go into in Somalia. There's piracy, and there's the sale of khat, which is that leaf that they were all chewing. That's it. The average Somali makes $600 a year and spends 169 of it on khat, which was sort of breathtaking when I learned that statistic. The rate of exchange for a dollar in Somalia in 2006 was 35,000 shillings. I mean, we're talking about a completely failed state. There's no economy, there's no government, there's no opportunity, there's certainly no military, and there's no navy to protect their waters. So while we didn't necessarily want people to sympathize with the pirates, we wanted people to understand the world from which those pirates came, so that there was a context in which you could somehow get your brain around what it is that they were doing and see them as human beings.
There's an old, kind of an old school theory of writing, which is to make your hero heroic, you just make your bad guy badder and badder and badder. And I think with this film, you don't go that route. You don't kind of, the Somalians, they're not sort of, arch nemesis. They're not sort of vile baddies. They are just people as well. But I was curious, does that create any when you're trying to do something that balanced? Is it still easy to actually create the tensions you need to create and keep the,
nothing about writing is easy. It's all equally hard. People ask me all the time, what was the hardest scene to write? And I can't think of one that was easy to write. Again, I had a pretty great director and a pretty spectacular movie star, which makes it look a lot more effortless, the making of a film, than it actually is. For me, again, the movie's about leadership. So the question was not, can I make Musey bad to make Phillips seem more good? The question was, put Phillips in a circumstance in which he keeps trying to lead. Even when he's a captive, he's trying to get the young guy, to save himself. He's trying to talk these guys out of suicide. He never stops trying to be a captain. In order to do that, it wasn't necessary for me to have Musey be an arch, mustache-twirling bad guy. It was just necessary for me to have him be complicated and complex. And I think, Paul got that on the first bounce.
Now, you've made a couple of other films that are based on real life stories. I'm thinking particularly of Shattered Glass and Breach. Now,
Even Glass, by the way, works in this building.
Oh, does he?
Yeah, he does.
That's strange.
On the 5th floor.
What I was going to say is that, unlike the previous two films that I mentioned, Captain Phillips is basically, he's a good guy. He's a hero. Whilst, you could make a case that with the previous two real life stories, you told the protagonist was, disgraced or to some extent, not good, for want of a better term. Is there a different? I guess what I'm curious about is when you're writing about somebody's downfall, it sort of feels to me, maybe wrongly, that would somehow be easier than when you're sort of, to an extent, putting someone on a platform a little bit and saying, "Wow, look at this guy. Look at how heroic." I suppose my question is it easier writing around a good guy or easier writing around, in quotes, a bad guy?
It's funny. I don't think of him that way at all. Screenwriting is an intellectual exercise that is designed to elicit an emotional response. And you have to think of it in those terms. If I'm writing a screenplay that's effective, when people read it and call me, they don't say, "Gee, what a smart script." They say, "Oh my God, I can't believe that guy died. Oh my God, I was so scared. I was so worried." They have an emotional response. If they don't respond that way, I know I need to keep writing because I haven't quite gotten to the simple emotional journey of it yet. If you think of it in that context, all I'm trying to do is make people feel. Shattered Glass, which about 3 people saw, it's a movie that the 3 that saw it really did care for it. But at its core, it has an emotional idea to it, which is what would happen if the least popular kid in high school had to take down the most popular kid in high school. That's what the movie's about for me. That's the emotional pulse of that movie for me. And Breach has a similarly emotional idea to it. In that context, I'm just trying to take people on an emotional journey. Okay. And I'm not thinking overly much about who's good and who's bad. I'm just trying to make them all human.
Yeah, that makes sense. You, as well as writing Shattered Glass and Breach, you also directed.
Yep.
Now, a lot of writers, think about or aspire to direct as well. How did you get that gig? And
well, first, I had no ambitions about directing, and I found at that point in my career, writers who talked a lot about wanting to direct to be fairly irritating. I really did. Then I worked on a movie. It was shooting in Prague, and it was in January. I don't know if you've ever been in Prague in January, but it's crazy cold. We were shooting an exterior, and everybody was out there freezing their ass off. And I had a trailer. As the writer of the movie, I was just sitting there very comfortably. And something about that felt very wrong to me. I felt like I wasn't on the front lines of my own career enough. And it was time to sort of stand in front of a movie and either take the bullets for it or ride the wave of it. And it was time to find out if I was grown up enough to do that job. Shattered Glass made sense to be a first movie because it had no car chases, no gunplay, no nudity, nothing blew up. It had none of those craft-driven things that I knew I had no idea how to do. It was just a question of could you capture tone or could you capture character? Could you basically tell a story? So the way I got that job was I had written it years before for HBO. While I was writing, all the executives at HBO that had hired me were fired.
Right.
Which is, I'm convinced, why I write so fast now, because I'm trying to get the draft in before the guy who hires me takes a bullet. And anyway, so the script was just sitting there. They didn't want to make it. They didn't want to give it back. But ultimately, they let me go out into the feature community with it. We went to 22 buyers. Back then, there still were 22 buyers. 21 said no. But Lionsgate was willing to take a meeting. And I went in for the first meeting as a director at Lionsgate, and I told them how I would shoot the movie. I mean, the way I prepared for that is the same way you would prepare. I took a lot of directors to lunch and asked them, what do you say in those meetings when you're pitching yourself as a director? And I took a lot of producers to lunch, producers that I had written for. And I said, okay, you've worked with first-time directors before. Where are the landmines? Where do they blow it? And I took notes like a journalist would. And then I asked all those producers, what about me specifically would worry you as a first-time director? And of course, you're hoping they'll say nothing. You're going to be awesome. But a couple of them said, well, I'll tell you what would worry me about you. And you have to pay attention to that. You have to correct those things about yourself. So I went into that first meeting with all of that, kind of loaded for bear. essentially saying, here's how I will use the camera to tell the story of this movie. And the specifics that I'm going to throw at you will change as I get better educated, because I don't know everything yet. But I know what's not going to change. What the movie's about is not going to change. And here's how I'm going to tell that story. And the meeting went well. And at the end of it, I just said to them, the writer in me is never going to let the director in me torpedo a movie. So let me try to cast it. If I can't, you won't have to fire me. I'll step aside and we'll put someone in who can get it cast. But let me try. And it was enough. They gave me just enough rope. And I was able to get Sarsgaard and Hayden and Chloe, and then off we went.
Do you think one of the reasons producers are a little wary of writers turned directors is perhaps they feel that the writer is going to be more concerned with protecting their script than...
Completely, no question. You don't even have to finish the question. And I think that writers who become directors to protect their work are doomed. And I think they should be, by the way. When a movie is not a filmed production of your beautiful screenplay. A movie is an exploration of what's living between the words. It's sometimes what you didn't write. It's where can the thing go? There's a mantra that you keep in your head when you're directing, which is just 3 words. It's beat the page. And that's what you're trying to do every single day. You're not trying to capture what you wrote. You're trying to do better than what you wrote, which might mean that an idea from an actor is better than yours. It might mean that an idea from a grip is better than yours. It might mean that you just figure something out on the day. But if you are directing from a very rigid place, where you're just trying to get all the words, because no one ever shot all the words that you wrote before, I think your actors are going to get rigid. I think your crew is going to get rigid. And I think you're going to have very grooved, canned performances. I don't think it's going to have any life to it, because I don't think anyone's going to feel they have permission to bring life to it. And the fact is that we need actors. We need that magic that they bring. They make the thing soar beyond the page, which is the whole goal.
Talking of that, to bring it back to Captain Phillips, there was a number of, amazing, I thought, kind of wordless moments from Hanks where I just thought, was that on the page? Was that he just seemed to kind of fill the space with sort of inner, sort of inner movie-style thoughts or whatever. You just thought, wow, there just seems to be a lot going on here and he's not really doing anything.
There is a lot going on there. I can't take credit for much of it. That's just Hanks. You try to leave a little room in your script for an actor to act. Ultimately, what an actor is there to do is act within the parentheses, The words don't matter in that context. The subtext matters completely. When you're on a set of a movie, you're almost never talking about dialogue. You're always talking about what the dialogue could mean. And, with a guy like Hanks, whose failure to get nominated for an Oscar, by the way, is such an injustice to me. I can't quite get over it. I would put the last 15 minutes of that performance up against any performance I've ever seen by anybody, ever. But part of what makes it so powerful is there is such an internal life going on there. He's always plotting. He's always trying to work this situation. And Paul's a smart enough director to just leave a camera on a great star. And the frame is kind of half of it is the chair and half of it is Hanks's face. But you can just see just with one eye, the way he's sort of clocking everything, there's a plot going on there. What I know about directing, I could download to an actor in about a week. Is there any amount of coaching from Tom Hanks that could turn me into that kind of an actor? No. He just has a gift.
Fair enough, it's true. I think, so talking about some of your body of work, of course you wrote the screenplay for Hunger Games.
I wrote one of the screenplays for the Hunger Games. That's very much Gary Ross's movie. I'm happy to have my name on a hit. It's better to have that than a flop. I've experienced that too. But I can't take a lot of credit for that movie. That's Gary's baby.
Well, what I was going to ask, regardless of your involvement levels or not,
sure,
is that in this business, presumably being associated with a film, being associated with a good film is obviously always great, but being associated with a film that overperforms considerably, that becomes something of a phenomenon, that generates sequels, franchise, etc. I'm assuming that there are some sort of knock-on effects of, meetings you can take or opportunities.
Well, mostly you get offered more movies that are like the Hunger Games.
Right, okay.
That's really what happens immediately. At this point, I've been doing it long enough. Enough people out there have not just read one thing of mine, but have read several things of mine. They have some sense of what I'm aspiring to do. So I didn't get pegged in any way.
Yeah.
but that is what the business wants to do. It would be advice that I would give to any writer: never do the same genre twice in a row if you can help it. The business so desperately wants to say, oh, that's the action guy. Yeah. Oh, she does romantic comedies. Oh yeah, he does set pieces. Like, and it's so stupid. Writing is just writing. And if you can write almost any genre. But yes, there was a brief period right after the Hunger Games where I was getting a lot of dystopian 16-year-old powerful girl stories.
And you managed to resist the urge to write one of those?
Yes, I did.
Are there any, as you just kind of covered, writing is writing, but are there any differences in the way you approach a kind of popcorn movie as opposed to, say, a movie with other responsibilities?
I don't think so. I think I'm trying to write the best, truest version of a popcorn movie every time I sit down. You know, when I think about my favorite movies of all time, I think The Godfather is clearly the best movie ever made. That's very much a popcorn movie. It just happens to be executed at such a high level. You know, I love Wizard of Oz and Jaws and Back to the Future. I mean, these are popcorn movies. They're just done better than other movies. I think in every great movie there is a terrible movie trying to get out. And you have to resist that. You have to just execute at the most elevated level every single decision that you make when you're making a movie. And I don't really differentiate between the popcorn movies I work on and the snob movies that I work on. I try to make them both the same thing.
When I was doing a little research, you had a couple of theories on screenwriting that I liked, so I'm just going to run them by you.
Sure.
The first one, which I just thought was very elegant, was you have a theory that I've called the two-problem protagonist.
Yes.
Which I'd love you to kind of explain a little bit, because I think it's a great way of approaching a script.
Sure. You've got a hero, and he's got an external problem that he's got to solve. That's the arc of your narrative, of your movie. But he's got an internal problem that he's got to solve too. That's what's broken about that character. In solving the external problem, he's going to solve the internal problem. The perfect example being Roy Scheider in Jaws. He's got a problem, which is there's a shark that's eating everybody in his town. He's got another problem, which is that he's afraid of the water. In solving one, he's going to solve the other. He's going to fix what's broken about him. If you can find a character that has a conscious goal that is in complete opposition to his subconscious goal, the friction of that is perfect storytelling. And that's why I go back to The Godfather. Michael Corleone, who tells us very early, that's my family K, that's not me, states his goal: I don't want to turn into my father. But inside, he's dying to turn into his father. And if you go back and look at every single beat of that movie, it's the battle of those two values. He's going to turn into his father. Oh, no, he's going to be okay. He's going to go the right way. No, he's going to turn into Don Vito. No, he's going to be fine. And it just keeps battling. And you have these visual cues along the way to let you know where his emotional temperature is at a given moment, until at the very end he falls one way or the other. And in this particular case, he does things that Vito Corleone never would have done on his most vicious day. And the struggle of that is the arc of the character and also the arc of the movie at the same time. It's just perfect writing.
That's very nicely put, thank you. Your other theory, which I think will take much less time, because I just loved that you said it. You said the reason rom-coms are crap, you might not use the word crap, is because they have no stakes.
Yeah.
And I just love that idea of why it's such a bland genre, because there's no stakes.
Yeah, why are rom-coms all so dull? It's because look, she lives in New York, he lives in LA, what are they going to do? You know, it's Skype, figure it out. Now, if you give me a woman who has to choose between two men, okay, yeah, maybe. A woman who has to choose between a man and her son, okay, I could write that. I mean, ultimately, what you're trying to do with any kind of character is give them dilemma. Dilemma meaning not a fake dilemma, I mean a real one, where they're choosing between two things of equal value. Two things that both matter to that character, so that giving up one is going to be a horrible experience for that character. In romantic comedies, there are always fake dilemmas. Your job as a screenwriter is to keep putting dilemmas in front of your character so that we can find out who they are under pressure. And the greater the pressure, the more revealing the choice. Not that it's a romantic comedy, it certainly is not, but Donald Sutherland at the end of Ordinary People has to choose between his wife and their son. What an awesome dilemma. No matter what he chooses, he's going to give up something that is of great value to him. That's going to reveal who that guy is. Dustin Hoffman at the end of Kramer versus Kramer has to decide between putting his son on the stand to win the trial and letting Meryl Streep have the kid. Brutal, brutal dilemma. No matter what he does, it's going to be agonizing. That's what you want to do. I mean, ultimately, what you want to do at the beginning of writing a movie, figure out what is hell to your particular character. And then at your second act crisis, put them there. That's the basic math of it. And hopefully that hell will be in some way triggered by that kind of dilemma, that kind of decision that you force on them.
What's your own writing process like in terms of, are you one of those people who starts off and just, with a blank page, just goes for it, or do you do a ton of research, or how do you?
Do you know how to do a sculpture of an elephant? Okay, you start with a block of granite, right? And you chip away everything that's not an elephant, right? There's no other way to do it, okay? I start by creating that block of granite. In a case like Captain Phillips, it's all the research I can do. But that would be true if I were writing an original screenplay too. It's everything I know about the world of that screenplay, everything. Even things that seem extraneous that I know I'm not going to use, just everything. And then you take a step back and you say, okay, where's the elephant in there? And you start to strip things away and chip things off. I always start with a treatment, and the building of that treatment is really where the work in screenwriting goes, at least for me. The treatment for Captain Phillips, I think, was 65 pages before I started writing. When you've got a 65-page treatment and you've made those kinds of decisions, I mean, I'm talking about tiny ones, you can write very fast. It's not unusual for me when I'm going from that phase into writing a screenplay to write 20-page days. Right. And if you just do the math in your head, that's six days. You've written the first draft. You know, it's a vomit draft. You wouldn't show it to anybody, but it's something you can start to rewrite. Now you've got another block of granite in front of you, and you can start chipping things away from that. What that does, at least for me, having a treatment of that size, and I literally write the screenplay out of that same file in my computer. I cannibalize the pages of the treatment to turn them into screenplay pages. And what it does for me is it takes the terror out of writing. There's never going to be a day where you're going to turn your computer on and this blank page is going to be staring at you, and there's this little cursor mocking you. You've got 65 pages there before you've started your script. Nice. It takes the pressure off.
I'll open it up to everyone in a second. I just wanted to finish off my questions by asking you a little bit about what you're working on now. I'd heard that you were looking at The Last Tycoon,
yes.
Is that right?
This is the most blissful writing experience of my life so far. I'm working on adapting The Last Tycoon, the F. Scott Fitzgerald book, as a series for HBO. And the writing of the Bible of that show is the most fun I've ever had writing in my life. I don't in any way mean to disparage screenplays. They've been my livelihood, and I love them. But compared to the forced economy of 110 pages, when you're sitting down and you have 5 years to arc a character, to tell a story, and all the storylines that can grow out of that, I would go into my office at 8 in the morning, and I'd look up and it'd be 6 in the afternoon, and I just didn't know where the day went. It was just bliss.
It sounds almost like a very different discipline to an extent. Creating a potential 5-year show as opposed to a one. Is that all coming from the original novel? No. So you're using the novel as a starting point and then spinning off.
Well, Fitzgerald died while he was writing it. He had a heart attack.
Oh yeah, that's right.
He had a heart attack in.
But they made a movie of it.
They did.
De Niro, I think.
Yep. He had a heart attack in 1940 and left the novel unfinished. So, I mean, it sounds presumptuous to say that we're going to finish F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel. That's not the attempt. But we're taking what he did and jumping off from there, and taking the character of Monroe Starr and Pat Brady and seeing where they can go.
Well, let's open it up, see if anyone's got any questions here. Anyone got a question for Billy?
How'd you get started as a screenwriter?
Well, there's actually someone here who helped me get started as a screenwriter. Sitting right there is a man named Jimmy Veras. When I was at UCLA during summers, I interned for 2 TV movie producers named Jim Green and Alan Epstein. Jimmy was running development for them, and he was my mentor. I literally followed him around from meeting to meeting, listened to him talk on the phone to understand the rhythms of how people talk to each other in the business, read everything that came through the office, and then would talk to him about what made it work and what didn't make it work. It was a great education for me, and I would not have been able to write had I not had that. The first thing I ever sold was actually while I was still working for Green Epstein. When I was 19, I sold an episode of The Jetsons.
Anyway, yes, over here.
You had mentioned the home scenes that didn't end up appearing.
Yeah.
But I was wondering, were those only after he had been captured, or did any of those take place before he had been captured? And why did you decide to start the movie where you did? And did you at any point think about?
There was more material at home pre-capture. In other words, there was more material at home with Phillips and his family. And again, it was an attempt. Here's what Phillips looks like when he wakes up in the morning. Here's what Musey looks like when he wakes up in the morning. It was always a cross-cut. Paul just needed less of it than I wrote, which is generally the truth when you're working with any director. There were a number of scenes that were written post-capture where you were sort of going through the torment that his wife Andrea was going through and understanding what it was like to have that press machine come to the house, getting both kids back from college. The Maersk line sent people to deal with the press and to liaise with the military. There were conversations that went all the way up to the White House. I wrote it all. Just didn't need it.
Yes, yes, yes.
Do you have any tips for improving your creativity? A glass of whiskey, drugs, what kind of routine?
Yeah, I do. Don't think of it as art. Think of it as work. Just treat it like a job. I take my son to his bus stop at 7:30 every morning. I'm at my desk at 8. Somebody feeds me at 1. I'm back at my desk at 1:20, writing until 6. I don't surf the web. I don't gamble online. I don't look at porn. I don't try to find old girlfriends on Facebook. I don't do anything but work, ever. I don't do anything that takes time. And I approach it that way because I'm not talented enough to go and think about it for 2 hours at Starbucks. I don't have a muse who's dropping by. I just think of it as my job in the same way I would if I were a mechanic. I'm just lucky that I'm not a mechanic. I write as fast as I possibly can so that I can spend time rewriting, which is where you're actually crafting something and making it good. But I really try, and I would encourage you to try, to take all the mythology out of it. 95% of my job is problem solving. Very little of it is about invention. It's just, does this work? Oh, no? Okay, what do I need to do to make it work? And you're kind of up under the hood all day long. At least that's my approach to it. And by the way, if you're an artist, it'll come out as art anyway.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. And particularly thank you, Billy.
Thanks
so
very much, everybody.